YouTube fandom community, Beatles fans, random people on the internet. My name is Giggens, and we are here today to talk about the Beatles Anthology 1, released on November 20th, 1995. This happens to be a UK original copy, which is awesome. I found this thing used for like 20 bucks or something. It was super cheap. It's a 3 LP set. So it was already open, but it's in fantastic shape. It's like someone played it once and then put it back, so I will very happily love this thing. I've had the cassette for years, since it came out originally in 1995. I vividly remember this era of the Beatles because that's when I started getting into them. I was about, I don't know, 7 or something. I was a little kid in the 90s. And really getting into the records my parents had, but then we got to see this thing on TV and watch the Beatles Anthology, and it was absolutely fascinating. Something just clicked with me, and I just was a fan for life watching this thing. Something about it gravitated, or I gravitated to it for some reason, like a magnet. I don't know why, but it was one of those things that might just be ingrained in my DNA. I was meant to enjoy this music and study them and read about them and all that kind of fun stuff. But anyways, this is an absolutely amazing document to show the Beatles' growth and the fire and the hunger that they had in their early years, which is really cool because you get to see them develop as songwriters. I mean, and it's funny because you get to take things that they did later on, like Sgt. Pepper, Abbey Road, White Album, and how great those records were. But then go back in time to when they were kids and hear their earliest demos. And, you know, this basically stops in like 1964, like midway through 64. So it's only the first couple of years of their like popularity, but then it's got stuff from way before then. So you get to hear them, you know, figure out their favorite Buddy Holly songs, and then, you know, eventually pick up and be a backing band for a while, and then do their Decca audition, and then finally get with Parlophone, EMI. And in that process, you hear them go from studying, you know, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Buddy Holly, Fats Domino songs, and kind of imitating that sound, and then slowly writing their own songs that take bits and pieces of those things, and then instantly give them their own little feel, their own little vibe that was special and different from what everybody else was doing. So even as teenagers, when John and Paul first started writing songs, and George, they already had something special that set them apart from other people, which is extremely rare. And especially to do that as a teenager and have that gift. They were meant to do this. They were put on this earth to be some of the most popular songwriters of all time, and it started with them as they were kids. Absolutely fantastic. But the big selling point in this thing obviously was Free as a Bird, which was the first new song by the Beatles since 1970, when, you know, the last single was The Long and Winding Road. So 25 years in between, I guess, the #1 record. Long and Winding Road probably went to #1. Free as a Bird, I think, did go to #1. Or no, it didn't. It went to I wrote that down. It's a top 10 single, I know that much. It may have been somewhere in the top 10. But Free as a Bird is absolutely fascinating, and it's a great way to start the album. It's cool that they put it as the first song on here, then you jump back in time to the earliest demo to see where it came from. You all know the story. For those of you who don't know, Yoko gave Paul a tape when John got inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a solo artist, and Paul did the speech. Yoko gave him a tape, said, hey, these are some unreleased songs that may have been earmarked for Paul, or something along those lines. And so Paul took it, and they had been working on this project. It was in the early stages of it, which the Anthology series also goes back to about 1970 when it was called Along the Winding Road. Neil Aspinall put this little detailed, you know, mini movie together of bits and clips from all over the world, and it never saw the light of day. And then this project came up again in the early 90s to really go in depth and have the Beatles tell their stories while they were still here. Which is, I mean, they were like 50 at the time. It's like, it makes them sound ancient, but like, you know, they were about 50 or something. They were pretty young. And so they took these songs. It was Free as a Bird, Real Love, Grow Old With Me, and Now and Then. It was 4 tracks on here, and so they thought, oh, Free as a Bird sounds interesting. It was just John and the piano, and by some stroke of magic, they were able to separate the voice from the piano because it was on 1 track, which is basically kind of maybe what demixing is considered these days. But they took that, and then the other Beatles added on their parts and their harmonies and changed some things around and made it into a Beatles song. And if you ask me, it's a Beatles song. Obviously, John isn't with us to hear it, and, you know, it was about 6 or 7 years before George died, but If you ask me, Free as a Bird and Real Love count as Beatles songs. Maybe I'm in the unpopular opinion there, but and also maybe it's just nostalgic because when I was a kid, I was like, ooh, a new Beatles song, sweet, this is cool. So I'll take it, but I think it's an absolutely amazing track, which is a great way to start the album. Like I said, it's interesting to hear them, and as Ringo famously said, it sounds like, oh, hearing the vocal harmonies, like, oh, it sounds just like them. And then George was like, yeah, it sounds like them now. Which is true. I think maybe if they were a band in the 90s, maybe this is how they would sound. It got that cool, lumbering bass and snare feel throughout the whole thing. And Ringo just keeping a solid beat with a couple of fills here and there. Very Ringo. George's solo was great. All three of the main singers, John, Paul, and George, get vocal spotlights. So it really shows them as being a group. Somehow they came together as the Beatles. This thing did go #1 in the U.S. It was 8 times platinum. It took about 6 weeks to go 3 times platinum, and it might help because the CD is 2 CDs, but and the tape was also 2 tapes. But it's also historical. You got Pete Best on here, you got Stuart Sutcliffe on here, you got all this original early days stuff, and it's just so cool to hear them grow and see the band that they would have become, especially when you hear the demos for Volume 2 and Volume 3. Hearing their demo process was just a whole different ballgame. But I wrote down a quote about this because I guess they asked Sean Lennon permission to see, like, hey, what do you think of this thing? And Sean says something along the lines of, well, it'll be weird to hear a dead guy on lead vocal, but give it a try, which from the Lennon side sounds like a very Lennon-esque thing to say. So it's interesting. Sean definitely has a lot of John's sense of humor, I'd say. But they got together in February of '94 to do Free as a Bird with Jeff Lynne. Jeff Emmerich was there, and they banged it out, and it sounds awesome. So, man, I can go on about this forever. I'm trying to condense this as much as possible. Anyway, the early versions of this thing on here, you start the album off with That'll Be the Day. And, you get to hear their heroes. Buddy Holly was one of their biggest inspirations. And especially John doing the Buddy Holly hiccup-style vocals. They were so dedicated to rock and roll and that cause, and wanted to prove themselves as a rock and roll band, and doing everything they could to show off that they knew how to play these songs better than anybody else. And this track proves it, one of their earliest recordings. Then you get In Spite of All the Danger, which is one of the earliest songs they ever wrote, and right there, it's a really good little song. It's got a good hook to it. It's a catchy little number with tight vocal harmonies, and you can tell that they took apart some of their other favorite songs and took bits and pieces of that, kind of made their own spin on it and did it for their own track, but works really well. And I think it's also got a vocal break in there. Yeah, it does. So there's a vocal break in there, which is like unheard of for a new band trying to write something as catchy and hook-like as that. That's impressive. But as you go through this thing, eventually, some of the earlier demos aren't a whole lot. But then you get to the stuff that they did with Tony Sheridan, like My Bonnie, Ain't She Sweet, and eventually Cry for a Shadow. And then eventually the Decca auditions with like Searchin', Three Cool Cats, Chic of Araby, Like Dreamers Do, which is a fantastic song, Hello Little Girl. Again, really, these couple of songs for me are really starting to show like where they'd get to for Please Please Me. Because at this point, you've got much tighter construction of a song. They have gelled very cohesively from touring non-stop, especially in Hamburg, where they'd play 7 or 8 hours a night, 7 or 8 days a week. I get it. Constantly playing music, and that's just how you learn. That's how you write songs. That's how you figure out what the other guys in your band are doing, and you work with that. And whatever happens, happens. I mean, you're going to be able to prove to yourself you can write songs after playing that much together. And then you get the Best of Me Mucho, which I think is just a fun little song, but apparently I can't imagine that ever being a big monstrous hit in the early 60s rock and roll, but that's just me. Fun song, though. And then you get to the end of side 2 with Love Me Do and How Do You Do It and Please Please Me, which, like, the first big 3 there. How Do You Do It was written for, bands to take on and have a lead single with. Jerry and the Pacemakers, I think that was one of their first songs that did go to #1. But the Beatles passed on it, and you can tell that they weren't interested in it because they don't sound that interested in it. It's a good song. They do a decent job with it, but, it could have been a hit for sure with the Beatles doing it, but I think having Love Me Do and Please Please Me having their own stamp on it, their own words, their own music. They wrote it. That's what they were into because they knew no one else could touch that stuff. That was their stuff. So that goes a long way. Then you jump into basically the next section of the album where Beatlemania starts. So you get stuff that was, done for their first album, their first handful of singles. There's not a lot of stuff on here from Please Please Me, but you get multiple takes of One After 909, which is a song they never really finished until 1969 when it came out with Let It Be a year after that. But it's cool to hear them try that, get things wrong, and start to goof off a little bit in the studio, figure out George Martin, figure out their place in the studio, figure out what they can get away with, and how much time it would take to record a song in between touring and press and doing interviews and going on radio shows. I mean, they were super busy at this point. Then you get stuff like Lend Me Your Comb, which didn't come out for a long time, until bootlegs later on. I'll Get You. And then you get to the live stuff, which I think is a lot of fun. This is like the height of Beatlemania at this point. A string of songs on here, like Money, From Me to You, You Really Got a Hold on Me, Roll Over Beethoven, She Loves You, Till There Was You, Twist and Shout, in which I think is from the Royal Performance, where he said, Just Rattle Your Jewelry. And yeah, that Moonlight Bay song is really fun from the show that they were on there. So most of side 3 and side 4 is Beatlemania. So you get that live experience, and it really get into the heart of when things started to get crazy, when they couldn't just go outside and go for a walk or go on the bus because people were chasing them and people were screaming at their shows. So you start off with them doing Buddy Holly covers on this little rinky-dink recorder to a worldwide phenomenon in 3 or 4 sides. Unbelievable growth. It must have been a whirlwind, spin your head like, what is happening moment from a lot of moments. And the rest of the record is some more radio stuff, but it's cool to hear them do Shout. A lot of bands did that song back in the day, but hear them do Shout is pretty cool. Their versions of like I'll Be Back, Long Tall Sally, You Can't Do That, Hard Day's Night, these early versions where they're figuring out the songs that would become so much a part of our DNA, hearing them in these different rough forms or just different, constructions or vocal melodies is really cool. Especially songs like No Reply, where it's like this big, happy, fun time song, which takes a completely different vibe on the record. So it's amazing they would have written a song and felt like, yeah, this is cool. We got this thing all laid out, and then completely flip it, and then do it for the LP. George's earliest songs is on here called You Know What to Do, which could have had something go on with it. Leave My Kitten Alone is a great song. I can't believe they left that off Beatles for Sale. And all the different versions of 8 Days a Week where you get like an a cappella intro or a different kind of drum intro or a hand clap. Very fun to hear them kind of play around with that before they figured out the best way to produce that song. There's just a lot of highlights on this thing between hearing them kind of flub words in the studio or live and have fun. The whole album is them having fun. There's nothing serious about it yet in terms of like, we need to be a serious band, which they never were, but you never hear them like do super heavy songs, which it was the time. I mean, they were writing pop songs for singing to girls. I mean, that's what Beatlemania was. They wanted to have a good time, meet people, be on the top of the charts, and be on top of the world. And a lot of this album, most of this album, is that. So to hear them experiment a little bit and kind of get a feel for the studio, a feel for themselves, what George Martin would do or help out with, it's fascinating to watch their growth. Because this only covers about, 1958 to 1964, but really 1962 to 1964. So within 2 years, writing their own material and just getting on top of the world and having people scream for them like crazy is unreal. Here's the back cover. We've all seen that. But the inside is where it gets interesting because it folds out in a trifold. So, the first part of the fold out, you got a lot of information about each track on here, the recording history about it, some details about it, which is really cool. And then, nice little bit about the Beatles there. And then it opens out again to more pictures and more information. But very cool. And I'll show you the discs here. Well, just one of them. They all look the same. So let me take out disc 1. And like I said, this is a UK copy, so I don't have a US copy of this one. My Anthology 2 and 3 are both sealed US copies. So I'm looking for a sealed American first copy. just because I'm a collector like that. But classic Apple label, which don't know if it'll show on this camera here. But there you go. So overall, I mean, instantly 10 out of 10 for me, if you ask me. I love the Beatles; they're one of my favorite bands. So I mean, to hear them do this and to be around in this time when this came out, it was so exciting. I remember I won't add a whole lot of personal stuff to my reviews, but I felt like this one was kind of cool. When I was about, yeah, I guess 8 or 9, whenever Anthology 3 came out, I remember for Christmas that year I'd gotten a very small little colored TV. It was probably like an 8-inch little screen, but it didn't work. You know, we had to return it because I remember plugging it in on Christmas morning. It didn't work, so we went to return it at the store we got it from, and I remember my parents were like, "Well, do you want the same TV?" And I was like, "No, like Beatles Anthology 3 is out. Like, I think I want that instead." And like they were like, "Are you sure?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I think I do." I still have it. So, good story there, but it was one of those things where I just felt so gravitated towards the band. This was such an exciting time to be a Beatles fan, having these 3 albums come out, having the video series on TV. It was such a cool time to re-experience the Beatles and how creative they were, and to have a period where you got new stuff from them that really wasn't available anywhere else besides bootlegs, and a lot of this wasn't on bootlegs, so it was really cool to have these things at that time. And fall in love with this stuff all over again. So for me, there's definitely a humongous nostalgia appeal with these things, but also historically, they're absolutely fascinating documents of one of the world's most important bands and their rise into musical stardom and power, and the road that took them there, and some of the stories behind how they created these songs that have become a part of our lives. So hearing the bare bones of what would become some of the most famous music ever recorded is absolutely fascinating. And 10 out of 10. Klaus Voormann did the cover for this, and also for 2 and 3, and also Revolver, and the When We Was Fab single, so they used Klaus's artwork a lot. Yeah, 10 out of 10. Let me know what you guys think about this thing. I really am excited to talk about the Anthology series. I'm going to do the other 2 as well at some point, but yeah, I was going to dig out my original cassette, but it's more fun to hold this thing for a change. So that's it. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye-bye.